My research question is, how can the City of Sydney reduce dependency on food consumption and provide for greater food security based on a more self-reliant system of urban agriculture? So what does it all mean? Well, food security is an interesting term that implies equal attention to all people at all times to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food for an active and healthy life. My research will look at how oil and natural gases to produce food and create food consumption can be reduced by the use of urban agriculture and concentrating food supplies within local limits of the urban environment, thus maintaining greater food security. Agriculture in the 21st century faces multiple challenges. It has to produce more food and fibre to feed a growing population with a smaller labour force. 50 years ago, most developed nations had over 10 times as many farmers and only half the amount of mouths to feed. Since that time, agriculture has tripled crop yields and now rely on the abundance of fossil fuels, making agriculture the second most fossil fuel intensive industry after transportation. Most people don't realize the amount of fossil fuels that goes into the production of food, even from organic farming. The global food industry accounts for 21% of worldwide fossil fuel consumption, and indirectly more than that. Without fossil fuels, how would we begin to rethink the ways in which we produce food? Ecologists commonly argue that agriculture's dependency is problematically unsustainable. As Richard Heinberg puts it, our way of life is fundamentally unsustainable. This not only means that it is an ecologically irresponsible process, but that it cannot continue. Without alternative methods, we risk the effect of a food collapse and a global calamity. To look at the global perspective of food consumption, we must consider how many mouths we have to feed. The world's population is expected to grow by over a third at 2.2 billion in the next 40 years to 2050. A significant part of the additional population will be in countries that have difficulties feeding themselves, which will mean more fossil fuel usage as greater transportation is needed to import and export agricultural produce. People living in cities rely on external farming sources to feed their needs. This current system exposes the urban lifestyle to risk and vulnerability of food insecurity. The solution to grow greener cities is in growing more of what we eat locally and regionally by localizing the food production. This means shifting to conscious design gardens based on ecosystem principles and natural ecology to revive soils and conserve water. By diversifying crops to permaculture standards means that more people have access to healthier foods. The attention to detail of numerous small plots makes a diversified garden more productive than farming, producing up to 5 times more than an experienced farm of the same size. The rise of global food prices of recent years, the food crisis of 2007 to 2008, and natural disasters have all highlighted the value of alternative food sources beyond the rural fringe and within urban suburbs. Decisions at the level of individual houses, firms, and collective initiatives enables effective management at the broader restructuring of food systems and will help to transform food markets. More hands equal greater attention to detail without using harmful chemicals and genetically modified organisms. So let's bring this global issue to Australia. In the mid-1970s, Australia's total farm area reached a peak of 500 million hectares and has since declined to a little more than 400 million hectares. We are losing farmland to the risk of soil degradation in salinity, acidity, and the encroachment of pests and weeds, as well as the capacity of urban, mining, and industrial areas. So why do we need all of this land? Looking at trade and statistics, Australia has the capacity to produce more food than needed, exporting 50% of produce overseas. So what do we do, and how can we combat this issue on a local level? Urban agriculture and food security advocates now propose for councils to have urban greening plans that are of an edible nature. Small patches of land available near footpaths that would otherwise be neglected or planted are unproductive and consume unnecessary water and fossil fuels in their maintenance. The City of Sydney has the capabilities of millions of miniature gardens with the application to curbside gardening alone, and is readily available solution. This possibility is a practical leap towards the future of food production in Sydney. So what do we have? As of recent years, the City of Sydney has responded to these local interests and the demand for public street agriculture, and is encouraging residents to plant footpath gardens. As a result, they have released 2 current policies to make it easier for people to start up gardens on public footpaths. There is even a grant to partially pay for planter boxes. Additionally, as a part of City of Sydney's broader plan for 2030, they intend to increase canopy coverage by 50%. Also, within their social policies for providing healthy communities, it is a principle that targets the desire for every resident to be within a 10-minute walk or 800 metre to fresh food. But is this enough? Needless to say, many of our footpaths still look like this. There is still so much potential for further urban agriculture growth that is being unharnessed. So what seems to be the problem? Could it be that the policies available are not strong enough to tackle the trunk issues, and can they be taken further? In this next slide, I've outlined a few potentially underlying issues of the currently enforced policies that I believe may be limiting Sydney streets to harness the urban agriculture at its full potential. Firstly, the policies are written to encourage residents to make their own initiative and participatory efforts, whereas the City of Sydney Council needs to make more of an involvement beyond its current measure. Within the policy, there is also a large exclusion zone which exists because of high pedestrian activity, which limits the street's capacity for further food growth. Attention to the detailed areas within this zone could be addressed to minimize the exclusion area and allow for more urban gardening. Education is another big thing. There have been many reports of garden removal because people are planting inappropriate species and interfering with underground services. Although there are checklists currently in place for people to avoid these mistakes, further enforcement is needed to educate the residents. There is also a council helpline for educational purposes. However, communities would benefit more with a greater push and encouragement by introducing competitions and initiative programs. In terms of cost of materials, the introduction of information for recycled material supplies or an exchange program would encourage more residents to grow their own gardens. One must also consider the nature of available space. How can we get the policy to expand beyond the location of footpaths towards parks or even building rooftops? Additionally, with a more horticulture experienced staff, the local council can potentially be further involved in the production of the city's agriculture. Finally, garden incentives such as an economic offset to local producers or a form of an exchange program for other food, supplies, seeds and materials could be used to encourage residents. Due to this limitation and extent of policy enforcement, local communities are starting to take their own initiative to achieve what they desire. Such examples include Michael Mobb's Sustainable Communities Plan in Chippendale, as well as his approach to consecutive road garden competitions called Reclaim the Curb. Thirdly, large landscape architectural firms such as McGregor Coxall have taken the initiative to create Sydney's first eco-village to be presented in 2018 at Green Square. So what else can the City of Sydney do to actively enforce a more self-reliant agriculture system at a much larger scale? Well, Havana City in Cuba did it, why not us? Organoponico Cuba is the largest program in sustainable urban agriculture ever undertaken. Cubans turned rooftops, patios, and virtually all open land in and around cities into labor-intensive organic gardens. This means that they are able to spread 7,000 organoponicos around the city. Within 3 to 4 years, Cuba was able to go from a fossil fuel-dependent country to a complete organic production of food. It uses only 8% of the city's land to supply citizens with over 90% of fresh fruit and vegetable, which is equivalent to 4 million tons of produce per year. This method not only provides healthy organic food at a fraction of the cost, but also provides employment to thousands of local people. Although the inspiration in Cuba is enormous, arguments can be created against the comparative example from the developing city of Havana to a highly developed city of Sydney. Would Sydney have to wait for a similar economic crisis to find the solution on whether to upscale urban agriculture food systems? Let's take a look at a smaller approach in the urban jungle of Los Angeles, USA. In South Central LA, the poverty of the people compelled them to seek improved access to nutritious food. Similar to Havana, the people of LA adopted unused land into community gardens. Ron Finley was one local resident in particular who actively and productively changed his attitudes towards guerrilla gardening, making change as a community leader at the forefront of LA's food desert. His drive to be able to find fresh organic fruit and vegetables within reasonable walking distance from his house led to a revolution of gardening all around LA. Ron's story explains the journey against a neighborhood without enforcement policies and ownership rights for gardening permission. His demand was rigid, and as a reflection, Ron and his fellow green activists led petitions against the city until they eventually backed off. This next case study will look at how government policies and partnerships with initiative organisations are used to achieve a new local food movement in London today. Developed in 2012, Capital Growth is a partnership initiative offering practical help, training, and support for local residents and community groups who want to grow their own food. The support program offers networking events, support for selling produce as a business, offers discounts on equipment, competition initiatives, fundraising support, local networks, and volunteering programs. Additionally, if you can't find your own land for your garden, Capital Growth will find access for you. Capital Growth has successfully demonstrated that a coordinated approach to community food growing works. It has involved over 99,000 community members, influenced policies that affect food growing, and ultimately has made people feel safer in their neighbourhoods. Capital Growth in London is the most encouraging scenario that would be applicable to the City of Sydney area. Commonalities existing between the community engagement and policy enforcement in both the City of Sydney scenario and in the London scenario reveals the potential for Sydney to expand as an urban agriculture provider. Amendments and additions to an enforcing policy needs to be addressed as a holistic approach to sustainability. Gardens and open spaces need to connect people to places as though the city were one giant building rather than individual blocks. A city vision should not involve enclosed blocks, but rather a latticework of living, breathing air and light penetrating bridges between buildings and rooftop gardens to bring people's needs closer together. These are the amendment and additions that I encourage the City of Sydney to consider. So we can live without oil, but we cannot live without food. Meeting the environmental and economic challenges of the 21st century will require reducing global food dependence on oil and natural gas. So we have seen how urban farming can bring people together to achieve a variety of planning and community building goals. When there is an increase in food security, the means of production are placed in local hands and there is restoration of the ecology of polluted neighbourhoods, city farms, and advanced social, economic, and environmental justice. With global networking and resource scarcity, urban farming is becoming a much more viable option that continues to grow in potential. With willing bodies, active hands, and skillful minds, who knows how far we could take it? Could this be Sydney in 2050?